isn't just business news, we're news for business people.
Hello, I'm delighted to be in conversation with Subir Gokan, India's representative to the Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund in Washington and former Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India. Subir, thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So Subir, what I thought we'd do was try to step back and take a big picture view of some of the issues from a macro perspective. And I actually wanted to start with your experience with the RBI, but more from a technical framework. So we are in a new inflation targeting and a monetary policy committee regime. And I think the transition has actually been fairly smooth. Some could argue that it's been helped by benign oil prices. But regardless, the point that I wanted to raise with you was one on inflation expectations. And I know you and I have had this conversation before. Inflation expectations become quite important and central to an inflation targeting regime, isn't it?
Exactly.
And the RBI's way of measuring inflation expectations today is about, through a survey. And you've been associated with that. Now, how important is the inflation expectations, and do we now have to think about how we measure expectations now that we are in this new regime?
Right. I think, as you said, the capturing of expectations is absolutely central to the inflation targeting regime, because the target is not just the immediate rate of inflation, it is also an attempt to bring inflation into a relatively narrow and stable band, whatever the number may be. So if you are stating 4% or 6% or 3% as a target, you're always going to be measured in terms of your effectiveness and therefore your credibility in terms of how close you are able to stick to this over a long period of time. So understanding what is happening with expectations gives you a sense of your risks, of deviating from that target. And I think that's therefore very important feedback into the whole decision-making process. Now, there are three ways of capturing expectations. There may be more, but in the way that I thought about this situation, we have the household survey, which is what you're referring to. And this started off a few years before I joined. And I think around the 16th round, we decided to publish it to give people a sense of the technicalities of doing it, whether it's credible or not. And it was a decision I took, but it was brewing. I mean, there was a lot of thinking within the Reserve Bank on whether this should be made public. I was fully in favor of it. I'm certainly a very firm believer in transparency, and this is trying to give markets a clear sense of what the thinking is. And we did it with that motivation. The second element of an expectations framework is business. And we were helped in this by the Industrial Outlook survey, which was done for asking companies what they think their input prices are going to look like, what their output prices are going to look like. So that brings in another dimension into the expectations judgment. And the third is markets. We did a few years ago introduce inflation-linked bonds. They are not trading with any stability or any volume. But that's a very important element into bringing what the financial markets think, or financial players think about inflation. So when you have all these three together, you'll have a fairly robust triangulated mechanism by which you can gauge whether inflation expectations are staying on track with your targets or they're deviating. And I think that's the key sort of requirement for an effective inflation targeting framework. And obviously, it's not going to happen overnight. You have to nurture them. You have to bring them into play. We have the household survey. We have the iOS. We've, I think, got to get the market piece into some level of efficiency, which I then think will give us a very robust foundation for implementing this inflation targeting framework.
The household inflation expectations, and I've done some work on it thanks to your decision to make the data available. I've tracked it, and it's actually striking that they're quite sticky in the sense roughly about 70% of households believe that long-term inflation is going to be in double digits. They think inflation, long-term inflation is greater than double digits, and they expect greater than double-digit inflation. And that's been fairly sticky except for some period of time. In that context, it just becomes extremely hard because right now the RBI's central role should be to temper expectations, right? I mean, through their measures. And we have an inflation targeting regime, but expectations seem to be fairly sticky and they're fairly high. Perhaps given our history, how does one address this?
I think when we're dealing with households, we have to recognize that the people you ask are going to respond based on their most immediate experience.
Correct.
So there's a recency and there's a frequency dimension to their responses. What do they buy most frequently? What did they buy most recently? And it's usually food. Almost, I'd say, inevitably food.
Absolutely.
And it's usually vegetables which you buy, on a daily basis. Almost even affluent households tend to buy vegetables very frequently. So that memory of what you last bought is a dominant input into this. So I think we have to accommodate that. The number is important, but I think the pattern and the persistence is a little more. Are they going up? Are they going down?
Right.
How significantly is volatility in vegetable prices, for example, shaping expectations? And I think that's an important input into the monetary policy process in terms of deviations. Are they going up? Are they coming down? But unless you have the other two elements also contributing to the judgment, you may be sort of missing out on a significant part of the puzzle. So I would be less concerned about the number. And more concerned about the pattern. And that is certainly something you want to shape because for the average household, the index number is of no particular relevance. It is about. So one judgment that you can make from this is how significantly, how seriously are food prices and the volatility in food prices sort of causing some disruption or diluting the efforts of the central bank to manage inflation.
So in fact, I have some empirical evidence on that. The single biggest driver, the explanatory variable of household inflation expectations is the previous 3-month CPI food inflation. There you go. So
absolutely, yeah.
So but unfortunately here in India, that's the most volatile.
That is, but as we've been saying, we can't wait for initial conditions to be perfect before engaging or treading down a path. So I mean, one can discuss the merits of targeting versus a different approach endlessly, and that's not what we want to do here. I think what we have to recognize once the regime is in place, what are the elements that are going to help it be successful? And I think it is this triangular perspective on expectations. You've got the households, you've got the firms, and you've got the markets. And when we get all these things into place, I think it gives us an anchor. And to me, the most important role of that anchor, that forward-looking view, is to let us know whether we're having, as a central bank, having an impact on people's thinking. And if there is some stability there, if there is some sense of comfort about the long-term trajectory, is it then going to help them make more meaningful long-term commitments, both in terms of household savings and consumption patterns and in terms of business investment patterns? That's ultimately what you want to get at.
Talk about fiscal issues in India, but more from a rules perspective. We could potentially argue that we've going through changes in the economy from a policy perspective that we've done so much in 2 years, be it from what we did with the currency or GST or other things like bankruptcy code, and we're trying to deal with NPAs in a new manner. So there's a view. These are one-time costs to the economy, and during such transition periods, it's okay to relax fiscal prudence. Do you subscribe?
No, I think the issue of fiscal prudence sort of transcends in individual circumstances. Of course, you can always argue that rules, when they're designed, have to accommodate shocks. They have to be flexible enough to, not to lock the government into a situation where it cannot respond to a shock. So I don't think there's any practical rule in place which does not give this flexibility. But then there have to be very clear, boundaries, if you will, or understanding on what are the circumstances in which these rules can be bent, or where the flexibility comes in. And typically in rule formation, these flexibilities are given to the government to deal with a very severe exogenous shock, and not a sort of necessarily, and of course one could debate what an exogenous shock is, but a policy transformation will have its own consequences, and you want to sort of use that flexibility to accommodate this, I think becomes an issue, because the ultimate test of a rule is credibility. How, once you set it up, how committed are you to adhering to it? This is true of inflation targeting, this is true of fiscal rules, or any rule for that matter. And if you undermine credibility in whatever fashion, then the value of the rule is gone. Then you might as well just go back to a discretionary kind of framework. So if you're committing to rule, and I'm talking generally, I'm not talking specifically of India. If you're committing to rule, then I think you have to accommodate the possibility, or the reality, that there are very, very limited circumstances under which the system will tolerate deviation before before sort of saying, look, there's no credibility to that rule. And I think the benefits of the rule also have to be seen. Why are you getting into rules in the first place? It is largely because in the absence of a rule, the kind of fiscal space that you need to pursue what might be considered sort of high priority, national interest and growth and inclusion and all of those very, very critical objectives, that space remains. And for example, if you are committing to an infrastructure, a publicly funded infrastructure strategy, and 1 year down the road, something happens which reduces the resources flowing into this, your strategy falls apart, because you cannot be stop and go on these kinds of commitments. Now we have many requirements that are going to put pressure on the fiscal situation from a long-term perspective. You have to make commitments, and you have to be consistent in your commitments over time. Infrastructure is the primary example, but there are others as well. And if you're not able to adhere to those commitments, the strategy falls apart. So I think rules help in allowing the government to make these kind of longer term commitments with credibility, with assurance that the resources are going to be there, and that people can actually come in, whether it's PPP or SPVs or whatever mechanism, that you can actually start doing that, putting those things into play.
You also represent countries such as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka on the board of the IMF. The one puzzle for us here in India is our exports growth. Just when the IMF projects 4% growth in volumes, which is I think the highest in about 6-7 years, and there's robust growth everywhere, India's exports are languishing, certainly losing market share in sectors such as textiles and apparels to countries such as Bangladesh. I'm assuming you've observed these countries quite closely. So can you explain what explains some of the rise of Bangladesh in the world exports market?
Bangladesh, 80% of Bangladesh exports are garments. And I think what you're seeing to some extent is the power of concentration, of focus, but also along with the focus come big risks. The system has to be sensitive.
So when you say focus, like policy focus?
Well, it's like you could say a sort of picking winners kind of thing, which is that the whole system is geared towards satisfying or meeting the requirements, the interests of the garment industry, because it's so dominant in their sort of on their radar screen, and so everything that comes in their way is dealt with fairly quickly, and it's paid off. I mean, in terms of growth, in terms of the employment that garment manufacturing generates, And the garment manufacturing community, the constituency, has become a very influential community in terms of their impact on policy decisions. So if there's a problem, they are heard, and there's every attempt made to address it. We are much more diversified. We have multiple lobbies or constituencies. And so being able to focus on one thing, I think, is a little more challenging for us. We've had successes in the past where pockets have worked. IDES is one example. Auto components is another. Pharma is a third. There are a number of them. But as people have pointed out, these are not necessarily the sort of labor-intensive, traditional labor-intensive manufacturing activity that we would like to succeed in, where our exports perhaps have languished a bit. So I think where we not
any policy lessons, specific policy lessons?
I think the larger debate in India on facilitating employment through reform of the labor regulations, through a combination of market flexibility, safety net, and skills. That's to me the triangular sort of model for employment generation. We have to try that. We have to put effort, and so it doesn't confine itself to garments. Garments will be one part of it, but there are other things that can benefit from this combination of
But is there empirical evidence from Bangladesh, for example? I mean, did they indulge in labor reforms?
Oh, absolutely. They had no legacy of the Industrial Disputes Act and its reforms. So the Bangladeshi labor market is, in a sense, what we have been aspiring to, which is great flexibility. So if business slumps, there is nothing that prevents workers from being fired. But because there is so much buoyancy in the industry, jobs are not very difficult to come by. So in a sense, there is a safety net provided by that focus.
Yeah.
Because not the whole industry isn't going to slump at the same time. Individual producers may. And so they're clustered, so that if you lose, it's Silicon Valley, clustering the benefits. If an IT company shut down, there are 5 others that are willing to hire your particular skill set. And in a sense, that is what works with clusters. We've had successful clusters where the safety net that the cluster itself provides is quite effective. If
even in textiles, we've had clusters.
Tirupur, Ludhiana, and so on, many others. But in many other industries also, where so one has to appreciate the safety net contribution of clusters themselves, so that if the worker is not threatened by the fact that a particular employer is going to shut down, then he is or she is therefore that much more willing to accept the contract that indicates flexibility. So I think we got to build a labor strategy based on these 3 elements. We have to give the employer flexibility. We have to provide some sort of a safety net, which may have different components. There may be an unemployment payment. There may be a sort of a clustering benefit. And we have to be quite responsive to changing skill requirements. So who produces this? I mean, is it entirely responsible to the state? Is it a combination of state, and is it a public-private partnership kind of thing that works? But unless we bring these elements together, I think competitiveness is going to be sort of somewhat lagging or somewhat less than it is.
And you see this across, say, other countries such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. I
think keep in mind, when we look at the origins of the special economic zone model, we certainly pay a lot of attention to China.
Right.
But the originator, in my understanding of this model, was Malaysia. Why Malaysia did it is very interesting. Malaysia imposed a whole set of restrictions on domestic enterprise through the Bumiputra requirements, which is the employment, ownership, other preferential treatment. But they realized that this was not helping, industry to grow. They couldn't dismantle it because of the domestic political, the configuration, the considerations. So the zones were created as a way to exempt enterprise located in the zones from all of these requirements. So essentially created a dual regulatory framework which put a completely different set of rules, laissez-faire, open, no restrictions hiring, no restrictions firing, and their exports took off. Now China followed that. by creating the special economic zones in the late 70s, early 80s, they essentially exempted enterprises located in those rules, in those zones, from all the rules that
Correct.
applied to
Yeah, so create
domestic
islands,
and so labor market flexibility was built into that model. They started to expand it into the interiors in the early 90s, but for the first 10 years of their regime, the zones were exempt. Now, we had this debate in the mid-2000s about, can we create zones where labor laws are, for example, not applicable. That debate went in the way of a one country, one legal system argument, and there are merits to that.
Correct.
But I think we have to understand that if we are trying to replicate the success of these countries,
then
there are some very core lessons that come from labor market policies that these countries followed. I don't think we can ignore those lessons.
But the only point that I would make in that regard, Subir, is labor in the Indian context is what we call a state subject, right? And in this framework of competitive federalism, if labor markets were, such a roadblock to export prosperity, if I can call it that, surely some states would have tried it, and because it's at the state level, we would have seen some sort of competitive forces kicking in.
Well, we've seen this. We've seen Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh doing it.
We've seen the change. We haven't seen the outcomes yet, right?
Well, let's look at. I think this is an important consideration because we are seeing states competing to outrank each other in the domestic ease of doing business framework, and you have states who are ranked very high on that list, but don't seem to be sort of showing immediate response. And immediate, I think, is in any case unrealistic.
Since we're talking jobs, and I've heard you talk quite passionately about the threat or the opportunity of technology and automation or artificial intelligence, however we want to call it. First, since again, given your kind of vantage point in Washington, how is this playing out in some of the other emerging markets that you're saying, the threat or the opportunity of automation, and then talk about its potential impact on India?
Well, I'm particularly, since I represent countries that are, three of whom are quite sort of have big stakes in garment exports. I'm particularly watching the entry of automation into processing of soft material.
Okay.
So far we've had robots making significant automation. Broadly speaking, robots is a bit humanizing it, but it's automation of the process into hard material processing, and certainly in the auto sector, or plastics, or even wood. Metal processing in general, they've been steadily sort of entering the system. So two issues which I'm watching, which I think we need to be concerned about. I'm not yet at the point where I can sort of categorize it as a threat or an opportunity, but I think we have to be thinking about these in a somewhat more organized and systematic fashion. And I'd like to sort of contribute to that debate as we move forward. One, on the soft material processing side, we have the entry of what are called SOBOTs, SEWBOTS, which are actually starting to show success in garment manufacture. There are a number of ways in which they do it, but bottom line is that it will be people displacing, if it succeeds, in this part of the world, and our neighbors to the east, who are all quite heavily invested into garments. This is something we need to be watching out for, because it can be very disruptive if garment manufacturing suddenly shifts its geographical access back to where the big markets are, and are manufactured by machines. We're already seeing this in footwear. We saw the Nike robot-made shoe, unveiled at the Rio Olympics and starting to get into the shoe stores now. And I think garments are not that far away. They're already being made, but at scale and so on, which the low cost, low end of the market, which is what these countries cater to, it's not that far away. That's one. I think we have to be concerned about. If this happens, how do we respond to it? I mean, do we locate those robots here? In which case, but then there's no particular reason. There's no geographic compulsion to do it. If you're not using people, then you don't need to locate where the people are. You can locate where the markets are. The second thing is, one thing I think which we've got to be watching out for is the penetration of automation and AI into what are called public relation functions, and that is essentially what our call centers, our business process outsourcing does. I personally, dealt with this, and it took me a while to realize I was talking to a machine when I was trying to solve some problem with my cable connection. They're very empathetic sounding. They're very empathetic sounding. They do not sound like that sort of machine language. And the first time I did it, it told me it was passing me on to a human operator, which who solved my problem. The second time I used it, it actually took me through a set of instructions, and I solved the problem without having to talk to a human operator. And I think when the kind of investment we have made and the success we've had with BPO is clearly under some sort of a threat right now. So how are we going to respond to this? There is an aspirational aspect to BPO employment. It is seen as white collar, computer oriented, and so on. So a lot of people who are finishing school, see this as sort of their entry into the middle class or down that trajectory. If it gets disrupted, how are we going to deal with it? So I think there are both significant economic dimensions to this issue, and there are social dimensions to this issue. And we've been talking off camera about inequality and its consequences.
Right. I'm going to come to that.
This is a big part of that story as well.
See, on automation and its impact on the textiles and apparel sector, since you brought up, and I'm using that as an example. Of course, one could say, listen, there were Singer sewing machines that came in, and we dealt with that transition. In hindsight, it all seems fine. Okay, we've transitioned seamlessly. So why would it be different with this transition?
Interesting point, and I've been trying to place this transition in some historical context as I try and understand it. It's absolutely correct to say that previous episodes of significant technological disruption have over time generally contributed positively. That is, you've seen significant increases in labor productivity, you've seen significant increase in household incomes as a result of that, and you've seen significant opening up of opportunities outside the core, which has allowed people to make the transitions. I mean, there would have been individual losers unquestionably, but at a social level, these new opportunities, systems emerged to provide skills for these new opportunities in whatever fashion, whether through formal education or through vocational training or whatever it is. So societies on the whole were able to demonstrate responsiveness to these changes in ways that allowed them to sort of take advantage of them. And then the next one came along and went through a similar process. So I don't dispute, or to me, that's why I said I'm agnostic on the eventual outcome. But I think we have to be prepared for it. I don't think that, to me, is the question that this process must be asking. I don't have answers. I want to flag the fact that it can hit us hard and it can hit us adversely if we are not adequately prepared. Now, if you reach a judgment that, look, we don't need to do anything different, and that is a collective wisdom of people saying that, okay, it comes, we deal with it, things move on.
Or maybe we can't do anything about it.
We can't do anything about it. But then we say, okay, that's where it stands. But I think we need to think this through. Are there things that we need to do differently, both at a public policy level and at a sort of business or commercial level? Education and skilling.
The political economy response to a threat like this the natural response would be to raise barriers, to protect the immediate and not so much worry about, but that's the incentive structure in a democracy that's as fixed tenures. That's a larger worry, isn't it? From the policy response to it, and it could be a race to the bottom.
Yeah. In fact, one of the most significant findings in a chapter in the World Economic Outlook that the fund produces every 6 months, and each one has a few analytical chapters. 2016, I think they did one on trade. And so when we're talking about slowing exports, that has been a trend globally, so we are not unique in experiencing slowing exports. But one important contributor to that global trend has been the rise of protectionism in variety of forms, direct trade barriers, other sort of indirect measures, and so on. And I think that is, as you're saying, it's almost a, if there's very little else you can do in the short term to resist this pressure. So this is attempting. So you have some sovereign powers to raise trade barriers, as we're seeing in the World Trade process, the WTO ministerial that just concluded a few days ago. That this is now starting to have some bearing, directly or indirectly, on the comfort that the world has had with an open trading regime to whatever extent it is. So if we start to see rollbacks in this platform, this mutual understanding, that could have consequences, across the board. So I think it's very important for us to act collectively to at least protect what we have, to preserve what we have on the global trading regime. I think that's an important objective. The aspiration to take it further, I think, as we can see, we've got to be realistic. There isn't any particular appetite, but at least let not that resistance sort of start pushing back and reducing. So that's a global understanding which we have to try and achieve. We have to work with other countries to
So
get
that's
that.
on trade. The policy response on technology could be very similar. I mean, I know Bill Gates called it a robot tax or whatever, but I mean, I can understand how tempting it can be from a political economy perspective to have something like a machine tax.
So these responses are often based on, I think, an immediate, quick grasp or quick inference drawn from these forces without necessarily putting them into their wider context.
I worry sometimes by raising this as an issue, the technology, it may trigger an adverse short-term policy response that could actually be worse in the longer.
That's why I think we have to understand it as fully and as completely as possible.
Sure.
You're right. I mean, scaremongering is quite easy to do, but so is denial. That's also easy to do. So somewhere between the scaring and denial, I think we have to find the middle ground. I think that's what long-term policy thinking should focus on.
Great. No, this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you,
Thanks
Subir,
for
and
hosting me.
Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
Are we live?